Have you ever wondered what it truly meant to dine like a lord or lady in the Middle Ages? Beyond the flicker of candlelight and the scent of roasted meat, meals were more than food. They were rituals of power, wealth, and survival. From the costly spices brought across continents, to the trenchers of bread that soaked up noble sauces before being handed to the poor, every bite carried meaning. Tonight, we'll step quietly into the great halls of medieval castles, exploring the storerooms, the kitchens, and the rituals that made a noble meal both magnificent and fragile. Stay with me, and by the end, you may see how what was placed on the medieval table revealed the entire order of their world. Chapter 1. A table fit for a lord. When you picture a medieval banquet, you may imagine long wooden tables groaning under the weight of roasted meats, golden goblets brimming with wine, and servants bustling about with trays of exotic dishes. This image is not entirely inaccurate. Yet behind the theatrical image of noble dining lay a world of rules, expenses, and practicalities that made the diet of medieval lords and ladies not only a symbol of wealth, but also a matter of survival, politics, and cultural identity. The diet of the wealthy in the Middle Ages was not simply about eating more food than peasants. It was about eating different food that required resources to obtain, labor to prepare, and connections to secure. Eating was in itself a performance of status. Each meal, even the simplest one, was a display of hierarchy. And in this hierarchy, what sat on the noble's plate said more about his or her place in society than any speech could. Bread, the foundation of wealth and status. Bread was the foundation of the medieval diet for all classes, but not all bread was created equal. For the poor, bread was often coarse, dark, and mixed with whatever grains could be afforded: rye, barley, oats, or even peas and beans ground into flour. For the nobility, bread was white, fine, and made from wheat that had been sifted to remove the bran. This white bread, often referred to as manchet in later centuries, was not just about taste. It was about purity and refinement. The ability to eat soft white bread meant access to land where wheat could be cultivated, mills that could finely grind flour, and laborers to produce it. Serving white bread at a meal was one of the simplest but clearest signals of wealth. But bread served another purpose at noble tables. It was often used as a plate. Thick slabs of bread called trenchers were placed before each diner, with food piled on top. After the meal, these trenchers, soaked with juices and flavors, were either eaten by the lower servants or given to the poor. Thus, even the simplest part of the meal connected the wealthy to an entire chain of labor and charity: meat, a sign of status and power. If bread was the staple, meat was the luxury. Nobles ate far more meat than peasants, and their access to different types of meat highlighted their privileges. Hunting rights, for instance, were tightly controlled in the Middle Ages. A lord could hunt deer, boar, and game birds on his estate, while peasants were often forbidden from hunting at all. At a noble table, venison was a prized dish, not only for its taste but also for what it symbolized: control over land and the right to take game from it. Boar's head was another classic dish, often roasted and presented whole as a centerpiece for a feast. Domestic animals also filled noble kitchens. Beef, pork, mutton, and poultry were common. Birds, especially swans and peacocks, were roasted and served with their feathers reattached for display. The meat of these birds was less important than the spectacle they created. To dine on a peacock was to remind guests that wealth could turn even nature into art. It is important to remember, though, that meat was not eaten daily in the quantities we might imagine. Preservation was difficult, and while salted and smoked meats extended storage, fresh meat was often reserved for feasts or important days. The expense of feeding a household with meat was immense, especially when one considers the number of retainers, servants, and guests that noble households were expected to feed. Fish, a religious necessity. Religion shaped diet as much as wealth. Medieval Christians were required to abstain from eating meat on many days of the year: Fridays, Lent, Advent, and numerous saints' days. This meant that fish became essential to the noble diet. Freshwater fish like pike, carp, and eels were raised in specially constructed fish ponds, a common feature of wealthy estates. Salted or dried fish, like cod and herring, came from long-distance trade. These were expensive commodities, requiring networks of merchants and preservation methods that tied noble diets to international trade. Shellfish, including oysters and mussels, were also consumed, though less frequently than one might expect today. For nobles, fish symbolized both religious obedience and access to resources that peasants could rarely afford. Spices, wealth on the tongue. Perhaps the most striking difference between the diet of nobles and that of peasants was the use of spices. Spices such as black pepper, cinnamon, cloves, nutmeg, ginger, and saffron were imported from Asia through complex and costly trade routes. Each pinch of spice was a reminder that wealth could bring the farthest corners of the world to a medieval table. Spices were not used, as is often claimed, to cover the taste of spoiled meat. Rather, they were symbols of refinement, variety, and wealth. To serve a dish with saffron, which turned food a brilliant golden color, was to literally eat wealth. The ritual of dining. For nobles, dining was not a private act but a ritual. Meals were often held in the Great Hall, where lords and ladies dined at a high table, slightly elevated above their household and guests. The seating arrangement reinforced hierarchy, as did the order of dishes served. Hand-washing before and after meals was a public ritual of cleanliness and civility. Servants carried basins of scented water for this purpose, emphasizing that noble dining was as much about manners as it was about food, music, entertainment, and ceremony often accompanied meals, especially feasts. Eating, in this sense, was part of governance itself, a visible display of wealth, generosity, and order, costs, and consequences. All of this luxury came at immense cost. Maintaining a noble household required vast resources not only in food but in servants, cooks, and stewards to manage supplies. Cooks trained in the preparation of elaborate sauces and dishes were highly valued. The kitchens of great houses were complex operations, with entire staffs dedicated to butchery, baking, brewing, and serving. The expense of noble diets was also a source of tension. In times of famine, when peasants starved, nobles still held banquets. This contrast reinforced class divisions, but also imposed obligations of charity. Many nobles distributed food to the poor at their gates, both as an act of Christian duty and as a demonstration of their wealth. An unfinished plate, as we look at the noble table, filled with white bread, roasted meats, fish from distant seas, and dishes colored with saffron. It is tempting to think only of luxury. Yet these meals were fragile, dependent on trade, labor, and the land itself. What happened when trade routes faltered, when famine struck, or when the church tightened its fasting rules? How did the diet of lords and ladies adapt to these pressures? That is the question we will explore next. Chapter 2. The Machinery of Feasting. If Section 1 revealed what the medieval nobility ate, Section 2 must reveal how those meals reached their tables. For behind every trencher of bread and every steaming platter of meat stood an army of laborers and a chain of logistics that began months, sometimes years, before a single bite was taken. To understand the expensive diet of medieval lords and ladies, one must step away from the Great Hall, where meals were served with pomp, and descend into the kitchens, storerooms, and cellars that kept a noble household running. The noble household as an engine of consumption. A medieval noble household was not a small private family unit. It was an institution in itself, sometimes numbering hundreds of people, all of whom had to be fed daily. A count or duke might keep dozens of retainers, soldiers, clerks, and servants. Guests, both expected and unexpected, swelled numbers further. Feeding all these mouths required planning on a scale that few modern families can imagine. Consider a single day at a large manor. Bread had to be baked in vast quantities, ale had to be brewed, and meat needed to be butchered and salted. Vegetables, fruits, and herbs needed to be harvested or purchased. Nothing was left to chance, for the reputation of the household rested on its ability to provide food consistently and generously. Storerooms and cellars. The heart of the noble food supply lay in its storerooms and cellars. Here, barrels of salted meat and fish were stacked high, ready to be drawn upon during winter or times of scarcity. Grains, wheat, barley, oats were kept in large sacks or wooden bins, carefully guarded against rodents and damp. Cellars stored casks of ale and wine. Ale, brewed from barley, was consumed daily, as water was often unsafe. Wine, imported from France, the Rhineland, or the Mediterranean, was a mark of wealth and refinement. These casks were not decorative, they were practical necessities, holding enough drink to sustain dozens of people day after day. Salt, the great preserver, occupied a place of honor in storerooms. Without salt, preserving meat and fish would have been impossible. Nobles often invested heavily in acquiring salt from distant mines, such as those at Salzburg, or through trade from the sea. Preservation methods. Preserving food was essential. Without refrigeration, medieval kitchens relied on a variety of techniques to ensure supplies lasted through seasons. Salting and smoking. Meats and fish were heavily salted, sometimes smoked, and stored for months. Salted herring, in particular, was a staple. Drying. Fruits like apples and pears could be sliced and dried, while grains and beans naturally kept well when dry. Pickling. Vegetables could be preserved in brine or vinegar. Honey, used not only for sweetness but also for preservation. Honey kept fruits edible long after harvest. These methods required resources, labor, and foresight. The very ability to preserve large quantities of food marked the difference between noble security and peasant insecurity. The kitchen, a world below stairs. If the great hall was a place of ceremony, the kitchen was a place of organized chaos. Noble kitchens were large, smoky, and bustling with activity. Fires burned constantly, heating cauldrons and roasting spits. The scent of meat and spices mixed with the smoke of oak and beech logs, filling the air. Cooks were highly skilled. Recipes from medieval cookbooks, such as the English form of curry or the French viandière, reveal complex preparations. Sauces made with almonds and wine, meat stewed with spices, pies encased in golden pastry. These dishes required knowledge, timing, and many hands. Servants rotated spits, ensuring even roasting. Bakers kneaded and shaped dough for the day's bread. Brewers stirred vats of fermenting ale. Pages carried trays of food up from the kitchen to the hall. Each role was vital, and each servant knew their place in the hierarchy. The role of the steward. Overseeing this operation was the steward, the managerial mind of the household. The steward kept accounts of what was bought, stored, and consumed. He ensured that supplies were neither wasted nor allowed to run out. Beneath him, clerks tallied loaves of bread, barrels of wine, and joints of meat. Records were detailed, sometimes down to the last penny, because mismanagement of food could bring disaster. The steward's role also extended to acquiring supplies. This meant negotiating with merchants, organizing transport, and sometimes overseeing the produce of the estate itself. A noble's wealth was often measured not in coin, but in the ability to supply food reliably to his household. Feasts and ordinary days. It is easy to think of noble dining in terms of feasts, those elaborate occasions when tables overflowed with dishes, musicians played, and banners waved. But the majority of meals were ordinary, taken quietly within the household. On feast days, the kitchens came alive with preparations that lasted days. Animals were slaughtered, dough rose in great batches, and sauces were simmered with imported spices. On ordinary days, meals were simpler, but still substantial: bread, meat, fish, and ale. Even these ordinary meals, however, dwarfed the diet of peasants, who might eat little more than pottage. Coarse bread and a few vegetables, food as gift and obligation. Noble diets extended beyond the walls of the household. Food was a form of currency, gift, and obligation. Lords sent venison or barrels of wine to allies as tokens of friendship. At Christmas or Easter, nobles distributed food to the poor, partly out of religious duty, partly to demonstrate generosity. Food also tied lords to their tenants. Rents were often paid in kind bushels of grain, sides of bacon, or gallons of ale. These goods passed through the estate's granaries and kitchens, becoming part of the larger machinery that fed the noble household. Imports and luxury items, not all foods came from the estate. Many had to be purchased from distant markets. Dried fruits, figs, raisins, and dates arrived from the Mediterranean. Sugar, rare and expensive, was imported from the Islamic world and later from Crusader states. Rice, too, made its way from Asia, though it remained a rarity. These imports were costly and inconsistent, subject to wars, weather, and the whims of trade. When they arrived, they were treasured. To serve rice pudding with sugar and almonds was a mark of sophistication. To color a dish with saffron was to signal connections stretching across continents. Waste and recycling, medieval kitchens were surprisingly efficient. Leftovers were not wasted. Trenchers of bread, soaked with meat juices, were given to the poor. Bones were boiled into broths. Fat was rendered for cooking or even candle making. In a world where scarcity was always near, even noble kitchens practiced forms of recycling, the fragility of abundance. For all this organization, noble diets were never secure. A bad harvest, disrupted trade, or war could strain even the wealthiest estates. Preserved supplies might carry a household through winter, but famine was a constant threat. When grain failed, when salt supplies dwindled, when armies raided, the machinery of noble consumption faltered. It is here, at the edge of plenty, that we glimpse the fragility of medieval abundance. A noble table might glitter with silver dishes, but its foundation was no less dependent on the rhythms of weather, land, and labor than the humblest peasant's bowl of pottage. Toward the table again, as we leave the storerooms, kitchens, and cellars behind, one question lingers. Once all this food was prepared and carried into the Great Hall, how was it consumed? What rules governed the act of eating itself? Who ate first? Who ate last? And how did manners shape the noble meal? That is where we will turn next. Chapter 3. Rituals at the Noble Table. When food finally emerged from the kitchen and into the Great Hall, it was no longer merely sustenance. It became a performance, a language of hierarchy and ritual that defined who mattered, who did not, and how wealth was displayed. If storerooms and kitchens revealed the machinery of feeding, the noble dining table revealed its meaning, the Great Hall as stage. The heart of a noble residence was the Great Hall, a cavernous room with high timber-bird ceilings, banners or tapestries on the walls, and a long central hearth for warmth. Meals here were not private family affairs. They were public, communal, and highly structured. At the upper end of the hall, often raised on a dais, sat the lord and lady of the household. Their table, sometimes called the high table, was draped with cloth, adorned with plate or silverware, and often brightly lit. From this position, the noble couple could be seen by everyone, just as actors are visible on a stage. Below them stretched rows of trestle tables where retainers, guests, and servants dined in descending order of status. The farther from the high table one sat, the lower one's place in the hierarchy. Even in eating, the structure of medieval society was mirrored. Table manners as social code, table manners were not trivial. They were a language through which respect and status were communicated. Manuals of courtesy, such as the Book of Courage in England, instructed diners on how to behave. Hand washing. Before meals, basins of water were brought out for washing hands. Cleanliness was both practical and symbolic. The trencher. Instead of plates, thick slices of stale bread served as the base for meat and sauce. At the end of the meal, these soaked trenchers might be eaten by lower-ranking servants or given to the poor. Eating order. Food was not served to everyone at once. Dishes were presented in courses, each consisting of multiple plates. The high table received first and best. Others ate only once higher tables had been served. Sharing. Diners often shared trenchers or cups, reminding all that eating was communal, not individual. To violate these codes, grabbing food out of turn, drinking greedily, speaking rudely was to dishonor one's place in society. The act of eating reinforced obedience as much as it provided nourishment. Ceremonial dishes, certain foods carried symbolic weight far beyond their taste. For instance, the boar's head, brought in with ceremony at Christmas. It represented abundance and martial strength. Peacock or swan, sometimes cooked and then redressed in their own feathers, these birds dazzled as centerpieces. They were more spectacle than nourishment. Subtleties. Elaborate sugar sculptures or colored marzipan figures presented between courses. These could depict saints, castles, or allegorical scenes, delighting and impressing guests. Such dishes were not necessary to feed the body. They were statements of power, artistry, and wealth, spices and status. The presence of spices at the table reinforced noble distinction. A dish flavored with cinnamon, cloves, or nutmeg marked the diner as someone connected to distant trade networks. Pepper, though common by today's standards, was a prized import in the Middle Ages, often worth its weight in silver. To eat spiced food was not just a sensory pleasure. It was a declaration that one's household commanded resources reaching as far as the Mediterranean, India, or beyond. The noble palate was global long before globalization. The role of drink. No meal was complete without drink. Ale, consumed by nearly all classes, was present in abundance. But for nobles, wine reigned supreme. White wines from Gascony, red wines from Burgundy, and sweet wines from the Mediterranean were staples of aristocratic tables. Drinking was also ritualized. Cups were shared, toasts were made, and in some cases, elaborate drinking vessels, like the hanap, a lidded goblet, were brought out for ceremony. Excessive drunkenness was frowned upon, though it was not unknown, the labor behind the performance. While nobles dined, servants worked ceaselessly. Carvers sliced meat at the high table with practiced precision. Cupbearers poured wine. Pages carried dishes to and fro. Musicians played softly in the background. Every movement was part of a carefully choreographed system. The noble meal was not simply eaten. It was enacted, a display of order and refinement that reminded everyone present of their role within the hierarchy. Guests and hospitality. Meals also served diplomatic and political functions. To invite guests to dine was to extend honor and forge alliances. How generously one fed guests reflected on one's reputation. A miserly table could harm a lord's standing, while an overflowing feast could cement loyalty. Hospitality was expected of nobles, but it was also a burden. Feeding large numbers of guests drained stores and demanded meticulous preparation. Yet refusal to host could be seen as dishonorable. Thus, the noble diet was both privilege and obligation. After the meal, when the feast ended, the great hall did not fall silent. Leftovers were distributed, trenchers carried out to the poor, and dishes cleaned. The ritual of dining rippled outward, touching not only those at the table, but also those in the surrounding town and countryside. The hall was swept, benches cleared, and preparations quietly began for the next meal. For as grand as noble dining appeared, it was also relentless. Every day required bread, ale, and meat. Every day repeated the cycle of storage, preparation, and consumption. Reflections on hierarchy in food. The noble diet of the Middle Ages was not defined only by what was eaten, but by how it was eaten. Every loaf of bread, every salted fish, every spiced sauce carried layers of meaning. To dine in a noble hall was to participate in a performance of wealth and hierarchy. Food was never just food, it was identity, power, and social glue. Even in the act of eating, the medieval world reminded itself of its structure. And yet, behind the glitter of silver goblets and the scent of saffron lay a fragility. A single poor harvest, a war that disrupted trade, or a pestilence that reduced laborers, could unravel the abundance. The noble table was impressive, but it was never secure. Closing thought. So the question remains, if noble dining was both spectacle and survival, privilege and burden, what does it reveal about the society that created it? Does the careful choreography of bread, meat, and wine tell us more about medieval luxury or about the anxieties hidden beneath its surface? Thank you for spending this quiet time with me tonight. I hope this slow journey through the meals of medieval lords and ladies helped you drift a little closer to rest. If you enjoyed this calm space and would like more gentle history to fall asleep to, please remember to like this video and subscribe to Quiet Boring Sleep. Your support helps me continue creating these peaceful stories, one detail at a time. Sleep well, and I'll see you in the next chapter.